Words tend to lose their meaning. Words get worn out, they desemanticize, they lose their meaning, or at least they change their meaning in time. In this summit about creativity, we have been listening to the word creativity, creativity, so many times that I'm afraid that we're beginning to doubt about its meaning. What does it mean? And as I said, words don't have a fixed meaning, but a fluctuant, a processing meaning. So I would like to share with you some opinions I have, some perceptions I have about the meaning of creativity and its relation to language. First of all, we need an operative and efficient definition of creativity. Because if we say creativity is the warm sun that rises every morning and gives a smile to our mind and to our soul, to our spirit, that doesn't help us at all. It might be a very poetic approach, but it doesn't help us understand, it doesn't help us be more creative, and it doesn't help us measure, assess creativity. So we need an operative, a very efficient definition about creativity. The definition I like most, of course, it's not mine, I just gathered it from literature and from learning, is a definition that says you can call creative a process, a phenomena, or a product that complies with two conditions. There are two requirements that a thing has to comply in order to be called and to be named creative or a creative product. The first feature, the first condition that that thing or event has to comply is that it is related to thinking and doing. You have to think and do. And the result of that doing is to achieve something that's new, original, different. Everybody who listens to what I just said would think, of course, you're repeating what everybody knows. It's nothing new. What's new about this? What's new about what I'm trying to tell you is that everything that's new is by definition strange. How can you imagine something new that's known, something new that's familiar? If you say creativity has to do with achieving, finding, producing, inventing the new has to be by definition strange, weird, odd, unheard of. And that's when the idea of creativity gets interesting, and it gets aggressive, and it gets very, very operative, because it tells you exactly what to do and how to proceed. So I would say to create is to achieve the unnormal, the not normal, the odd, the whimsical, the strange, the weird. When everybody thought that the earth was flat, when the normal way of thinking was that the earth was flat, the mere idea that the earth was round was abnormal, totally abnormal, out of the scope of what's thinkable. When everybody thought that the earth was the center of the universe, the mere idea that the earth was not the center of the universe was completely abnormal. So when I mean not normal, I'm meaning that kind of thoughts that go against the normal normal way of thinking. That is creativity. So it's not only to do something, but it's to do something that hasn't been done before, to do something that's so new that it's strange. That's the first condition. As a consequence of that definition, the students and the teachers should find new problems and solve them in new ways. But relating this to what I just said, those new problems should be strange problems. Children should be encouraged to find weird problems, odd problems, different problems, unheard problems. And we, together, teachers and students, should try to find odd and strange solution to those problems. In order to achieve this, both students and teachers should be acquainted with simple creative methods, such as first perceive and speak the problem in many different ways. The idea of quantity is most important. If you perceive a problem in one different way, or in 5 different ways, or in 10 different ways, it's not enough. The critical point where you begin to produce creative, new perceptions or solutions is around 20 answers. So at least you should have 20 different perceptions of the thing in order to find interesting answers, new answers to the stated problem. So quantity of ideas is utmost important because it statistically allows the possibility to quality of ideas, to really new ideas. And then with that catalog of ideas, you should find among them the strangest, the rarest, the most infrequent, the most peculiar ideas. That's creative. Because if you have a catalog of 10 alternatives and you choose the alternative that everybody knows and that everybody has seen, what's creative about it? That's the first condition. The second condition is related to problem solving. That strangeness, that newness, that uniqueness of the answer has to solve a problem. This is very important because this criteria takes out of the equation everything that's absurd, ridiculous, whimsical, extravagant, and has nothing to do with reality. So problem solving is what brings that otherness and that strangeness to a social useful purpose. So to create is also to solve problems. If an action or a product complies with those two conditions, then we could say that's creative. Otherwise, we might call it expressive, we might call it interesting, we might call it intelligent, or whatever. But in order to assess and to understand and to see if something is creative or not, I work with this definition, which I called an operative definition because it helps me operate. It helps me develop, it helps me teach, and it helps me control if the products are creative or not. But of course, if we want to speak problems differently, if we want to talk problems differently, if we want to find strangeness in our perception, the problem is language. The way you perceive and formulate a problem determines its eventual solution. If you perceive a problem within a normal range of language, if you perceive a problem speaking normally, you probably won't solve it creatively. You will solve it normally because the way you perceive it determines the way you go and search for a solution. So we're beginning to think that the language is what hinders us from being creative. And by language, I don't mean French, Spanish, or Arab. But by language, I mean a system of signs, a semantic system of signs for communication. So it can be body language, it can be musical language, whatever system of signs. So I'm not talking about dictionaries, I'm talking about that every language, in order to be communicational, has a set of rules. And if you think within those set of rules, it will be very difficult for you to be creative because you're already constrained by that semantic set of rules. So we should explore which aspects of language would help us be creative, or what to do against that tyranny, that pressure of the normativeness of language that doesn't allow us to be creative. Let us remember that you can think only within a given language. Whatever you think only within a language. You cannot think outside of a language. So how can you try to think outside of the box if you cannot think outside of your own language? That means everything you think, everything you speak, everything you perceive ends up being very from this side and not from the other side, from the side of the creative, of the possible, because language hinders you to achieve that aim. So the limits of that language are the limits of your thought. In that sense, it would be most urgent to break the limits of the language, to go further with the limits, to expand the limits of your thought. Well, then we should go and ask the linguists about what chances we have to break the rules and the tyranny of language that doesn't allow us to think outside of the language, thus to think outside of the box. The Russian linguist Roman Jakobson, language, he stated some ways in which language can operate. He calls them the functions of language. He states four main functions, different functions of language, and there are 3 or 4 additional ones, which are not so important, but they are there. In this context, what interests us are the 2 functions of language called the poetic function and the descriptive function of language. Let me begin with the descriptive function. That's the function I am using right now. Now I'm using the descriptive function of language. Well, it's the everyday language. You use language to denotate, to say precise meanings, to inform, to describe, much the way the whole thing in this meeting is occurring. The whole thing in this meeting is occurring in the descriptive function of language. We could say in the scientific function of language. An example would be, I stood up, went to the window, opened the window, it was raining. That's a description of a set of acts. In drawing, you have the same thing. You can make a descriptive drawing of whatever. That's the realism. You describe the object. The other function that interests us most in this context, and it is opposed to the descriptive function. It cannot go together. They are mutually exclusive, is the poetic function of language. Which is the poetic function? The poetic function of language is when you use not denotative terms but connotative terms, when you use not words that have a single meaning, monosemic, but words that have many possible meanings, polysemic, when you use figures of speech, like metaphors, what the poets do. So the poetic function of language is a way, a door out of the constraints of normal, day-to-day, descriptive function of language. As an example, the window opened and I saw that the sky was crying. The window doesn't open by itself, and the sky doesn't cry. So it's not a description, it's a metaphor. It's another way of putting things. That other way of putting things expands the possibility of its semantics, of its understanding, and there's the way, the door into new thoughts and new perceptions. In the classroom, The consequence of this is enormous because we should avoid worn-out words. For example, we should avoid the word creativity. We should always use fresher synonyms or analogous terms in order to refreshen our perception and avoid that words desemanticize, lose their meaning by inertia, by proper flux of times. For example, instead of brainstorming, in our class we say mental diarrhea. It gives a much vivid idea of what it's about. Use figures of speech. Go into Wikipedia and look for figures of speech. There's metonymies, synecdoches, metaphors, of course, exaggerations, personification. There's lots of mechanisms that are called figures of speech. That is, how to say something without saying it, how to say something in another way. That the tour you make opens the door to different meanings and opens the door to the possibility of a different way of perceiving and thinking, because you perceive in terms of speech, you perceive in terms of language, you don't perceive with other senses. It's very difficult to perceive. Even if you perceive colors, then you translate them into words. That's language. There's a very interesting question. Why do we see 7 colors in the rainbow? The rainbow is a continuous band, it's a degradé, continuous fluxes of electromagnetic waves. Why do we see only 7 colors? Because there are 7 words for that. So language constrains your perception, even your visual, your optical persuasion. So use figures of speech. Third, break the tyranny of language just by subverting its logic, because language has a logic by itself, by its essence. A very nice example we do at school is to say, today we will build an unhouse, an anti-house. Let's build a house that's not a house. And then thing goes on and they say, okay, then today the classroom won't be a classroom. The classroom will be an anti-classroom and no classroom, and you're not the teacher, you're an A teacher, and we're A students, and they begin to understand the situation of students being in the classroom as a different, creatively different perception of the thing, because they are using the language in a different way. So subvert the tyranny of logic, and that's what children do. They play in mipi diapatly, and they joy, and all those things are marvelous ways to break the rules of speech. And of course, the last most interesting alternative to break language is invent new words. When we design a bottle, for example, we first establish what makes a bottle bottly, what's the bottliness of a bottle. So they state the paradigms of the object, and then we should make unbottly bottles and things that solve the problems of the bottle, because they have to solve the problem better than the bottle, but without being bottly. So by inventing new words, you invent new approaches to understanding the thing. How shoeish is this shoe? Shoes are shoesque by definition. So if you want to invent the shoe, if you want to create the shoe, you have to determine what's the shoeiness of the shoe and avoid the shoeiness. The shoeier the shoe is, the less creative it is. You must be wondering, why do I have this guy with me? Well, how rabbity is it? The rabbitiness of this rabbit might determine if it's creative or not. Thank you very much.